You check your bank account, and there's more money in it than your parents ever made in a year. You're not in debt. You're not behind on rent. There's actually food in your fridge. Good food, food you chose, not whatever was cheapest. By every measurable standard, you're okay. And yet, somewhere underneath all of that, there's this low hum of dread you can't fully explain. This quiet, persistent feeling that it could all disappear, that you don't quite deserve to be here, that you should be spending less, saving more, preparing for some disaster that's always just around the corner, even when the data says there's no disaster coming. You don't tell people this because it sounds ungrateful. You've worked hard to get here. You're supposed to feel good about it, and some days you do, but that feeling, that unease, it doesn't go away. It just sits there waiting. If that resonates with you in any way, I want you to stay with me, because I don't think you're broken. I think you're responding exactly the way you were wired to respond. And understanding that difference, between being broken and being wired changes everything. The conventional explanation for this is pretty simple. People say, you grew up without money, so you have a scarcity mindset. Learn to think abundantly, practice gratitude, visualize wealth, affirm that money flows easily into your life. This is the version you find in self-help books, in Instagram captions, in finance podcasts that want to sell you a course. And it's not entirely wrong. Mindset does matter, right? But here's what that explanation gets completely backwards. It treats the scarcity mindset as a thought pattern you chose, as though your brain just picked the wrong filter for reality, and you can swap it out with the right affirmations in a morning journal. Let me give you a concrete example of why that's not quite right. Imagine you lived in a house for years where the roof occasionally leaked. Not every day, just sometimes, unpredictably, when the rain was heavy enough. You learned to sleep with one part of your brain alert. You learned to scan the ceiling when you woke up. You learned to keep towels nearby, just in case. Now, years later, you live in a solid building with a perfect roof. No leaks, structurally sound, but you still wake up and check the ceiling. You still feel that low-level scan happening. Is that a thought pattern you chose, or is that a nervous system that learned to protect you from something real? The scarcity mindset that forms in childhood poverty isn't a belief you picked. It was trained into the deepest parts of your psychology at an age when you had no choice but to absorb the rules of the world as you found them. And those rules were real and they were accurate. The problem isn't that your brain learned wrong. The problem is that your brain learned too well. The emotional layer, what poverty actually teaches. Let's start where this actually starts, which isn't with money. It's with uncertainty. Growing up without reliable financial stability isn't just about not having things. It's about not being able to predict when things will be okay and when they won't. Researchers who study childhood adversity say, people like Bruce McEwen and others in the field of developmental neuroscience have shown that it's not deprivation itself that does the most psychological damage. It's the unpredictability, the not knowing. When a child grows up in an environment where resources are inconsistent, where there's sometimes enough and sometimes not, where the electricity might be on or off, where dinner might be a full meal or whatever's left, that child's nervous system adapts. It moves away from what researchers call a default safety orientation and toward what you might think of as a permanent low-level threat detection. The brain learns calm is temporary, good is fragile. Prepare anyway. This isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like survival mode when you're in it. It just feels like how things are. You're a kid. You don't have a comparison point. So you absorb it as truth. The world is a place where good things don't last, where you have to hold tightly to what little you have, where relaxing fully is a kind of naivety you can't afford. That lesson gets encoded not just as a belief, but as a physiological pattern. Your body learns to carry a baseline tension. Your attention learns to prioritize threat over possibility, and that encoding happens early. during the years when the brain is most plastic, most impressionable, and it's most shaped by experience. The psychological layer. What happens when the money changes? Now, here's where it gets interesting and a little uncomfortable. Most people assume that if you change someone's financial circumstances long enough, their psychology catches up. Given enough time, enough income, enough stability, the old patterns dissolve. And for some things, that's true. And you learn to buy the name brand version. You stop hoarding small amounts. You stop feeling physically sick when you spend money on something you need, mostly. But there's a deeper layer that doesn't update just because the bank balance does. Psychologists call this implicit memory. It's the kind of memory that isn't stored in words or stories. It's stored in habits, in instincts, in automatic reactions. You don't remember deciding to be anxious about money. The anxiety isn't attached to a story. It's just there. And implicit memory is notoriously resistant to conscious change because it was never formed through conscious thought in the first place. This is why someone can intellectually know they have a healthy savings account and still feel the urge to buy 5 of something when it goes on sale. Because what if they can't get it later? It's why someone can earn 3 times what their parents ever did and still feel a jolt of panic when they spend money on themselves. It's why they feel safest when they're saving, when they're restricting, when they're preparing, even when preparation is no longer necessary. The brain's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, if you want the neuroscience, doesn't automatically update when the external danger passes. It updates through repeated experience of safety, combined with the kind of processing that helps the emotional brain learn a new rule. And that's slow, often difficult work. Not because people aren't trying, but because the original learning was deeper than any current information can easily reach. There's also something that psychologist Senthil Mullainathan documented extensively in his research on scarcity. And this is important because it flips the popular narrative completely. Mullainathan found that when people are operating in scarcity with, whether that's of money, time, or food, the cognitive bandwidth available for everything else actually shrinks. The mind tunnels, it focuses intensely on the immediate shortage and has less capacity for long-term thinking, planning, and what he called slack. The mental flexibility that makes good decisions possible. This means something people who grew up poor are almost never given credit for. They weren't making bad financial decisions because they were irresponsible or short-sighted. They were making those decisions with a genuinely compromised cognitive infrastructure, one that scarcity itself had created. That's not an excuse, that's a mechanism. And understanding mechanisms is how you actually change things. The practical reality layer, how it shows up now. So what does this look like in adult life when the scarcity is technically over? It shows up in the inability to spend without guilt, even on things that are clearly within budget. The internal math is always recalculating, always checking. Is this safe? Am I being irresponsible? What if something happens? It shows up in a strange relationship with savings where no amount ever feels like enough. Someone who grew up poor might save diligently and still feel financially insecure with 6 months of expenses saved. Because the fear was never about the number. The fear is about what the world does when you let your guard down. It shows up as a complicated response to wealth itself. Sometimes in the form of guilt, particularly if you're more financially stable than family members who aren't. Sometimes in a quiet, disorienting sense that comfort is somehow morally suspicious, that working hard to feel okay is one thing, but enjoying it is something else, something you haven't fully earned permission for yet. And it shows up. And this is perhaps the quietest form, as a difficulty imagining a future where things are genuinely okay, not just survivable, actually okay. The future feels like something you endure and manage, not something you build toward with any real confidence. Because hope, for a brain trained in scarcity, has always come with risk attached. To hope too much is to be unprepared for the moment it falls apart Here's the shift that I think actually matters. And it's not change your mindset, it's something more specific than that. The question most people in this situation are unconsciously asking themselves is, how much money do I need to feel safe? And they keep trying to answer it. They hit one savings goal and move the threshold. They earn more and the anxiety migrates to something else. They're optimizing for a feeling that keeps moving because the question itself is wrong. And the right question isn't how much money you need. It's what would it take for my nervous system to register that the emergency is over. Now that's a different question, because it locates the problem correctly, not in the bank account, but in the part of you that hasn't received the update. And when you ask that question, the answer isn't a number. It's a practice. It's a set of repeated experiences of safety that slowly, incrementally begin to rewrite the implicit memory. Not all at once. Not with affirmations, but through something more like evidence accumulated slowly until the body starts to believe what the bank account has been saying for years. This matters because it changes what you're actually working on. You're not trying to think differently about money. You're trying to help a part of yourself, a younger, more frightened part, understand that it can finally, carefully begin to rest. The first thing, and I want to say this clearly because we've established how deep this goes, the first thing is to stop treating your financial anxiety as a character flaw. We've just walked through the neuroscience and the behavioral research that explains exactly why this pattern forms. It was adaptive. It was intelligent. It kept you oriented toward survival in an environment where survival required attention. The problem isn't that you're broken. The problem is that a very sophisticated system is still running a program that you no longer need. Recognizing that difference is where the actual work starts, because shame is the single most effective way to keep implicit patterns locked in place. The second thing is what I'd call building a savings floor, not a savings ceiling, because we've established that the anxiety about money was never fundamentally about the number. The goal isn't to hit some amount and assume you'll feel better. The goal is to create a floor in a realistic, concrete emergency fund that you define once and then stop renegotiating. 3 months of expenses, 6 if your income is variable, define it, build it, and then, this is the hard part, practice treating it as done. Because the pattern that grew up in scarcity wants to keep optimizing past every finish line. Recognizing when you've crossed the finish line and consciously choosing to stop is itself a form of retraining. Third, the guilt around spending on yourself is doing something specific that we've now named. It's the tunnel vision of scarcity still operating, treating every expenditure as a potential emergency, even when there's no emergency present. One concrete way to disrupt that pattern, like not eliminate it overnight, but genuinely disrupt it, is a small, regular, pre-committed personal spend. Not a luxury, just something chosen, chosen for no reason other than that you want it. And the amount doesn't matter. What matters is the practice of making the decision in advance, removing the moment of guilt, and then allowing yourself to have the thing without catastrophizing. You're not spending money, you're practicing evidence. You're giving your nervous system a small, low-stakes data point that spending doesn't lead to disaster. And finally, and this one is about the longer horizon, the relationship to future thinking. We talked about how the scarcity-trained brain has difficulty imagining a genuinely okay future because hope has always felt dangerous. One way to begin to shift that practically is to start making very low stakes future plans, not financial plans with high stakes attached. Small things, a trip you want to take in 6 months, a thing you want to learn next year. The point, New England, isn't the plan itself. The point is the act of imagining forward without bracing for the floor to fall out. That's a skill. And like any skill formed through implicit memory, it builds through repetition, not through deciding to feel differently. I want to leave you with something that I think is worth sitting with for a minute. The version of you that learned to worry about money, that learned to hold tightly, that learned to scan for threats and keep emergency plans and never fully exhale, that version of you was not wrong. That was intelligence operating correctly in the environment it was given. And the goal now isn't to erase that part of yourself or to be ashamed of it or to fix it as though it were a malfunction. The goal is something quieter. It's helping that part of you understand that the landscape changed, that the rules you learned were accurate once and they were learned in a place you don't live anymore. That takes time. It takes more time than most financial advice accounts for. But the fact that you've built a different life, that you're here watching this, trying to understand yourself rather than just pushing the anxiety aside, that's not nothing. That's actually how this kind of change happens, not in a single revelation, in a series of small moments where you choose understanding over shame, patience over pressure, and the possibility of rest over the familiar comfort of always being ready for the worst. The emergency slowly is becoming the past. Your nervous system just hasn't gotten the message yet. But it can. We talked today about how scarcity rewires the brain in childhood. But there's a question that naturally follows. And it's one I've been thinking about a lot. If that programming runs this deep, what does it actually do to how you make financial decisions day to day? Not just how you feel, but the specific choices you make, the ones that don't make logical sense, even to you in the moment. That's what the next video is about. And I think some of what we find there is going to be even more surprising than what we covered today.